In this video, we're going to start looking at some theology of the Old Testament. We're going to be looking at what the Old Testament has to say about God and what the Old Testament has to say about humanity. In an earlier video in this series, we made a distinction between the theology of the Bible, theology in the Bible, and theology with the Bible. Here we're talking about theology with the Bible and theology in the Bible. What does the Bible say theologically, and how do we then apply that in ministry or in our lives as faithful members of the community of faith? And one of the things we realize is that the Old Testament doesn't really have a systematic presentation of theology. It doesn't set up a list of categories about God and humanity and sin and salvation and dump all of its statements about God into one box and all of its statements about humanity into another box and that sort of thing. So we sort of have to reconstruct what the Bible says about all these topics by looking at all of the evidence throughout the Torah and the prophets and the writings to see these things. And in fact, biblical theology is quite different as a discipline from systematic doctrinal or dogmatic theology. The Old Testament is not really concerned with intellectual formulations of things. It's not really making a logical argument, at least not in the same way as some of the writings in the New Testament make logical arguments, but rather it presents what it sees about, what it believes about God and humanity through stories and through reflections on those stories. The Old Testament primarily knows God through God's actions. God is what He does. And the primary way in which God is known in the Old Testament is through the Exodus, through deliverance of His people from slavery in Egypt. And even the Ten Commandments themselves, this great summary of many of God's commands begin with this idea that God is the God who liberates or who frees from slavery. And because God has acted in gracefulness to the people of Israel, they are to respond to Him by doing some of the things that He requires. Monotheism, as we've said in other videos, is a late development in Israel's history. It's really insisted on by some of the prophets, in particular the prophet sometimes called Second Isaiah 40 to 55, Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Some of the writings that are even later than that, Ecclesiastes, for example, assumes that there is only one God over all of the nations of the earth. Doesn't need to make that argument anymore because that argument has already been made. But the God of Israel demands exclusive obedience, both in the early parts where God is amongst all of the other gods, and in the later parts where God is understood to be the only God over all the kingdoms of the earth. We are not allowed, the people of Israel, children of Israel, are not allowed to worship another God alongside or in place of the God of heaven. The idea of God's election of Israel, God's choosing of Israel, or making Israel His chosen people, this also shows some development. Early on, the earlier writings of the Old Testament seem only to be concerned with the nation of Israel in terms of theology. They talk about the other nations as they affect and as they interact with Israel, and as Israel affects and interacts with them. But in the earlier books of the Old Testament, it doesn't seem like there's much awareness that the God of Israel might in fact be concerned with the people in Egypt, for example, or the people in Assyria. But some of the later writings in the Old Testament, like a book of Jonah or the book of Ruth, part of what they might be doing is extending the love of God, the concern of God, into other nations of the earth. Even our sworn enemies, Assyria, might be a target of God's love and God's concern. God says to Jonah, "Should I not be concerned about Nineveh, that great city that has 100,000 people and lots of animals that don't know their right hand from their left hand?" And it's a remarkable statement about the increasing concern of God and the increasing awareness on the part of the Israelites, on the part of the Jews, about God's concern for other people in the world. But even so, even though Israel comes to believe that God might in fact be concerned about all of the nations under heaven, the Jews are still given a particular task, a particular responsibility to keep the law. And God's choice of Israel to keep the law is not an oppression or not any kind of repressive sort of idea. God is not a demanding sort of God, but God really shows concern, has chosen Israel to be the one who will carry out these laws in particular ways. In Jewish theology today, this is a very strong idea that the law is for the Jews only and doesn't really apply to Gentiles or to those who are not of Jewish faith and heritage. But as Christians, when we look toward the Jewish law, we can still see some importance there, because even though a lot of these laws are concerned with rituals and sacrifices and things that have been done away with by Jesus, who the book of Hebrews says is our great high priest, nevertheless, there's still some importance there for what the Old Testament tells us about how we should live our lives. And just to illustrate this very quickly, one of the differences, or perhaps the key difference between humans and animals, according to the Old Testament, is that humans, or perhaps we should say human animals versus non-human animals, that humans are able to think, to use their minds, to reflect on what they are doing. When humans, for example, satisfy their hunger, they're not, or we are not just following an instinct. Yes, we are following an instinct. Our stomachs hurt, and that tells us that we're hungry, or we feel weak, or something like that. And so that is an instinct, but we can fulfill, or we can satisfy this need through many different ways. We can choose to eat a dish that has meat in it, for example, or some people are vegetarians and don't eat meat, and they choose to satisfy that instinctual need in a different way. Humans choose how they're going to satisfy that instinctual need. But non-human animals, on the other hand, satisfy their instinctual need through an instinctual satisfaction. So lions don't really think about what they're eating. Lions eat lion food, which in the continent of Africa, lions eat gazelles or zebras or whatever it is that they have to chase and catch and kill and eat. Lions do not lie down with lambs, and wolves do not lie down with lambs. There's a great vision in Isaiah chapter 11 that the lion will eat straw like the ox. Well, in reality, that doesn't happen. Lions eat the food that are instinctual for lions to eat. But it still gives a great vision of how ultimately all violence will will cease on the earth. This is the grand vision of Isaiah chapter 11. So to bring this together, the humanity, and in particular, according to the Old Testament, the Israelites or the Jews, are called to think about what they're doing, to make even the day-to-day things that we do in our lives, even the things that we do to stay alive, can be acts of worship to God, can be ways in which we can express our faithfulness to God. To bring this video to a conclusion, we see that the Old Testament talks about God in a particular way. God is known through what God does. God is a redeemer from slavery, and God always works to redeem people from slavery. And humans are called to return worship, return praise to God, sometimes even in the simple moments of life. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time when we talk about what some of the things that the Old Testament says about salvation and holiness.